out and running. And YouTube says that we're in business. Okay, that goes and lives on that monitor while I take care of everything else on this monitor. Well, try to. All right, so I think I've got myself laid up in the computer arrangements. It's same thing as going through the trouble of doing the handouts and all of that other, in person, just a different set of techniques. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Just a little bit of class Zoom etiquette. We are going to be talking about Shelot Utshuvot, which is the fancy way of saying questions and answers. And if you want to use the Latin term, those are Responsas. And if you see that misspelled anywhere in the handout, I apologize. I tried to catch all of them, but autocorrect kept trying to make the word responsa turn into the word response. But since this is about questions and answers throughout Jewish law, that means I hope that people will feel willing and eager to ask questions. Now, the easiest way to ask a question in Zoom is to raise your hand. And if you mouse over yourself, there should be a little button for reactions that allows you to throw up that little hand that will look something like that, for example. And I will accept any version of hand, thumb, or otherwise putting it up there so that I know what you are trying to do. It doesn't have to be the official hand raising. And that way I will try to respond, because that's the idea behind the whole discussion tonight. Before we get into the nitty gritty of our question, I want to talk about asking questions, because this is a huge part of Jewish literature and a big part of Jewish belief. Unfortunately, a lot of people, when they think of Jewish writings, when they start naming them, they will say, well, you got the Torah and you have the rest of Tanakh, and then maybe they'll get to Midrash or Mishnah and probably mention the Talmud. And they might mention a few of the law codes, maybe Rambam, maybe Joseph Caro, that kind of thing. And then there's not a whole lot of other books that they can name for the last 2,000 years. And the reason for that is because the majority of the books that were being made over the last 2,000 years were not being made as books. There were some, Guide for the Perplexed and writings by Sadia Gaon and others. And as the time went on, many more books of theology and philosophy. But the majority of writing that was taking place in a Jewish context was Shelot Utshuvot, were questions, where people were actually sending questions to rabbis to get answers about questions of either practical or general knowledge. And that makes up a huge body of literature, which often gets mislabeled or misidentified. People think, oh, that's just halakha, but it's living, active, breathing, vital part. And we've learned much about Jewish life and even more, of course, about Jewish belief and practice from it. So I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to that type of literature before we get down into the nitty-gritty of how we handle some of the modern questions, and in particular, the theme of Jewish women within those questions. So if you're all on board, let's get started. And hopefully my mouse will work for me this time. All right. So in the beginning, God gave the Torah to our people. Hooray, wonderful. Problems are all solved. We're all good, right? Well, no, we do have to read it, right? It's not an audio book. Even if you come and hear our beautiful Torah chanters, it does still require reading. And if you read it, you're probably going to have questions, because it is not a book that is self-explanatory. And as I've talked in my pathway class about text, no book is self-explanatory. It always requires engagement by an active reader and interpretation. But that means that even if we think we know what's going on, we are going to have to provide new answers for some of these new questions. And What types of things are going to require these new answers? Well, complicated situations. For example, and these are all taken from real situations found in the tshuva literature. My wife's father had promised me a share in the business, but died before it was done. His kids don't want to honor the promise. So somebody might write to a rabbi if their local rabbi, or might ask their local rabbi, and if their local rabbi didn't feel capable of answering, he might ask to another rabbi that he respected, trying to get information about this. They would provide, of course, a lot more details of the situation, of exactly what kind of promise was made. Was it a witness promised? And all of that type of information. But this is the kind of question that needs an answer that is not going to be the kind of thing you can just look up in a law book or look up in the Mishnah or Talmud. You will need more of a interaction, of an engagement between the questioner and somebody to provide an answer. Oh, come on. There we go. Or, for example, the local lord demands that we swear an oath on his Bible to be able to do business in the area. Is this allowed? There were many issues of what it was like to be a Jew living within a predominantly Christian or Muslim world for most of the last 2,000 years, and often with very impinged civil rights, of how we could navigate that, of how do we avoid some of the problems of either crossing the religious line or engaging in idolatry. Are we allowed to use coins that are minted with images of their faith? These were all very real questions that needed real answers that were not something you could just look up in a book. There were also, of course, brand new situations. For example, can I use electricity on Shabbat? A very important one that you can look in some of my videos about Shabbat to find more information on how this gets answered. But until the late 1800s, there was no such thing as electricity in regular usage. So how could we have had an answer about it? Instead, people would go to the rabbis and say, look, rabbis, this is new invention. What does it mean? How does it fit within Judaism? And the rabbis, of course, didn't just say, oh, they had to comb through the depths of Jewish tradition and through precedent and through all of the other sheilot uchuvot, the other questions and answers from the last couple thousand years, to try and come up with a framework in which to integrate these new topics. Or, for example, I live north of the Arctic Circle. How do I observe Shabbat? Right? The sun never sets or the sun never rises for a very long time. It's going to be awfully hard to celebrate Shabbat by just looking for 3 stars. So these are all real questions that came up that needed new answers. And of course, there are changing circumstances. That is to say, the circumstances in which previous answers were given have shifted over time. And the question arises, with the changing of the circumstances, do we get a different answer? For example, how do we prevent women from being unduly affected by poverty? The causes of poverty and the way that poverty often singled out women more than men changed over time. And thus the remedies were also changing over time. Likewise, how do we handle the remission of debts when it seems to be hurting the poor people more nowadays? That is to say, hurting them a lot more than not allowing the remission of debts. And this was something that was handled way back when, all the way in the time of the Second Temple. So we can see that the giving of answers and the looking for information is something that goes an ongoing process. For example, in the Middle Ages, we had the question, is it still okay to marry more than one woman? Now, this is something where you might say, well, of course, in Jewish law, it's very clear that having more than one wife is perfectly acceptable. But the changing social circumstances and the changing feelings about the morality of polygamy that were occurring throughout Europe, not only in the Jewish community, meant that this became an active topic again. And in case you don't know, spoiler alert, the answer to that question is no, it is not okay to marry more than one woman nowadays, and hasn't been for about 1,000 years. All right, is everybody following with me so far? Seeing no questions or objections. Very good. So there are some famous rulings that you might be aware of throughout our history where people have given answers that have become very, very common. So for example, we now require a ketubah to protect women. This was the answer to how do we protect women from being unduly influenced by many of the causes of poverty, and by putting together a marriage contract that would protect her in the case of death or in the case of divorce. It helped insulate women from the being alienated from the land, which would leave her poor. Or, as I already mentioned from Rabbeinu Gershom, we have a ruling that polygamy is no longer allowed. And perhaps the most famous tshuva that people don't realize is a tshuva is the Siddur. That prayer book that you are holding in your hands is based upon the answer to a question. A group in Spain wrote to the Gaonim in Babylon, that is to say, all the way across the known world at the time, asking for a little more guidance about how to actually formulate their prayers. The basic structure in the Talmud and Mishnah is a little bit of a skeleton, giving us the key elements as well as key phrases, but they wanted a little bit more meat on those bones. And they received back a fully written out version of the Siddur, at least of that person's idea. It turns out that particular group didn't follow it very closely. They sort of picked and chose from different aspects, but that became the template of a Siddur that influenced all of the Jewish world up till this day. So that tshuva had a very long-reaching impact into Jewish life. And more to the modern world, tshuvot allowing and permitting organ donation have been extremely important in the 20th century for helping Jews to both receive and give organs when needed, as has been the tshuvot on IVF treatments and other fertility courses of treatment that have allowed many more people to have children and for us to know their status within Judaism to make sure that they can be a fully recognized member of the community. So this is not a hypothetical situation. These have real impacts on real questions that affect real people. And this has been the most active and widespread Jewish activity for most of the last 2,000 years. More people would be engaged in this process than engaged with the philosophers. More people would be engaged with this than would be engaged with mysticism. More people would be engaged with this than would be engaged in the erudite study of Talmud or Jewish law in and of itself. People wanted answers to their questions. They would bring them, and then they would try to find those answers. But that then leads us with the next question. Who are we asking? Because she'elot u'tshuvot, questions and answers, implies that there is a questioner and an answerer, somebody that is providing the answers. So what is that position? What is that role within Judaism? And most importantly, to start, on what authority are they allowed to give those answers? These answers that, as you can see, have shaped Jewish life. Well, the Torah told us to. We can find in the Torah itself here in the famous passage of Deuteronomy 7, if a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen and appear before the Levitical priests or the magistrate in charge at the time and present your problem. When they have announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place that the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all their instructions to you. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given you and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announce to you, either to the right or to the left. Quick question. Somebody asked in the chat. I don't always see the chat notification, so I apologize if I'm a little late sometimes. They wanted to know about the organ donation, about whether that is a ruling in the conservative movement or whether that's accepted throughout the different forms of Judaism, conservative, Reform, and Orthodox. And the answer to that is there is nothing that is universally accepted throughout Judaism except the idea of there being one God. But the idea that organ donation is permissible is accepted by almost all versions of Judaism, both Orthodox, or rather Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Jews, and most subgroups within those categories do accept organ donation. There have been a few breakaways from that normative behavior since the early part of the decisions, but by and large, it still continues to be a widely accepted position within the Jewish world. All right, so the authority to ask questions and for those questions to be decided by the local leaders of the time comes from the Torah itself. The Torah itself understood that there would be questions that would be too hard to answer. That sure, anyone can ask, is bacon kosher? And just about anyone can answer, no, it's not. But the questions that we looked at before are often questions that are hard to simply say, of course, this is the answer. There is likely to be debate, discussion, disagreement, controversy, and eventually we want to reach a more sound, reasoned, and established opinion rather than letting each person simply do what they want. And this is where the authority for those decisions comes from. So that means rabbis are speaking for God, right? Deuteronomy says, if you got a problem, you go to the local magistrate, and because we don't have the Sanhedrin that was originally being mentioned, and they will tell you what to do, and everything is fine, right? Well, not exactly, right? As we see in this wonderful article, wonderful writing from the Responsa of the Maharam of Minsk in the 15th century, and perhaps you will say, since these rabbis have decided, it is proper that they interpret their own decision in accordance with their intention. And we should just ask them. Meaning that if a rabbi has made a decision and has published a tshuva, published a responsa that outlines the different reasons why they made the decision the way they did and what the answer should be in that particular case, if we have difficulty with that piece of information, if we have difficulty with their responsa, then we should call them up, or more likely call them in or send them a letter to get more information about what they meant by it. And he is going to say, this is not the case, because it doesn't depend on their opinion, but only on the meaning of the decision according to the way they wrote it. And that doesn't depend on their interpretation. Once a rabbi, in this case, we're really talking about a posek, somebody that is rendering a legal judgment, once they have committed that into the public domain, they have released it as their opinion based off their reasoning, it becomes the property of the Jewish people. And it is no longer subject to their interpretation. It is now subject to the interpretation of all of us, of the entirety of the Jewish people. And that means their opinion of what they meant by it is no more privileged than the opinion of another rabbi that is reading it and using it for application in their own circumstance or community. For those of you that are avid followers of the Supreme Court, this means that we are not strict constructionalists. We do not care about the original intent of the founding fathers or any of the original or any of the precedents of different courts. We care about what was written and how that can be interpreted by the people who are alive today. Indeed, as we find in Bava Metzia, in the Talmud, that in the Heavenly Academy, the Heavenly Academy argues with God. And if it was dependent on the one who wrote and sealed the decision, then here too, God wrote and gave the Torah. So they wouldn't argue with God. Rather, they argue about the interpretation, how to interpret the Torah God gave us. So here too, it is the same. And indeed, there are famous stories, most famous Tanur Shel Achnai, where we are proclaiming that the Torah was given to us in order that we can interpret it, that we can use it. And that means it is a human activity and one that may be less fancy than expecting a voice from heaven to always answer our questions, but it is also much more reliable and something which can build consensus and understanding because it is transparent, it is open, and it is an activity that everyone can participate in, unlike prophetic revelation, which is limited to very, very few people. So we don't doubt that God wrote the Torah. We are not arguing with God. but we do have the right and the need to argue about the interpretation of what God has given us means for any given situation. So rabbis are speaking for God then, right? They're interpreting what God gave. And yes, we're not changing it, and we're not claiming that it's wrong, but we do interpret. So that means we're speaking for God. Well, not exactly. As we see from, again, the case in the Talmud, for 3 years, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai argued. One said, the halacha is like us, and the other said, the halacha is like us. A heavenly voice emerged and said, these and these are the words of the living God, and the laws in accordance with Beit Hillel. Now, just understand the radical nature of this. You have two different academies arguing about interpretation of Jewish law. And a voice comes out and doesn't tell us this one is right and this one is right. Instead comes out and tells us both of these are correct. Judaism is rather special in that we accept the idea that there can be more than one correct interpretation of what God has asked us to do in any given situation. There is a correct procedure for discovering and implementing it, but two different people engaged in the process with the best of intentions and with the same resources may come to two different conclusions, perhaps even opposite, like Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, and that's okay. Those two groups are both engaged in correct interpretation, and either interpretation would be a correct version of what the Torah is asking us to do. And yes, this is a very radical notion, and one that is not widely accepted by most other faith traditions, or indeed even most other cultures or political traditions. But Judaism recognizes that there isn't an answer key to the questions of the Torah. We can't look in the back of the book to find out what we are supposed to do when we have a question that is not immediately answered by the text directly. And that means that it is the process by seeking these questions, seeking the answers to these questions, that is the more dependable tool rather than the answer itself. If the process is engaged in good faith, if a person is following both precedent as well as the pattern of interpretation, then the answer they come to can be considered good and reliable. Now, we still have to answer the question then why in this case did one side get the extra thumbs up? Well, as it explains, because the house of Hillel was more humble. They would teach the laws, they would teach their own teachings and the teaching of their opponents, Beit Shammai, and they would even teach their opponents' words first. That ability to show deference to another and respect is very important. But even more important is this is demonstrating that they were considering their opponent's view as they were also forming their own. And that shows that they had a greater respect and a greater breadth of understanding of the issue, because they were willing to listen to multiple opinions that had not occurred to them yet. And then their own answer would be a distillation of their opponent's view, as well as their own interpretation, reaching a sounder conclusion, since none of us are ever as smart as all of us. All right, I'm sort of racing through this in order to get to the good stuff, but we have a question that we have to work out here, which is, what if I don't think my rabbi is Hillel or Akiva or any of the great sages? How am I supposed to trust my rabbi for making these decisions? We're not the first generation to ask that question, right? We can go back again in the Talmud and say, why were the names of the 70 elders, those that accompanied Moses to the foot of Mount Sinai, why were they not specified? Why aren't they listed in the Torah? And trust me, we've got plenty of other lists of names. Why weren't those people named? Answer, so that a person not say, is so-and-so, meaning my local rabbi, like Moses and Aaron, is so-and-so like Nadav and Avihu, two other people of great stature, are so-and-so like Eldad and Medad? The answer, of course, being, of course, your local rabbi is not Moses or Aaron, or even Nadav and Avihu, or even Eldad and Medad, but your local rabbi might be like one of those 70 elders that don't even get named. That within that group of anonymity, we can imagine the regular run-of-the-mill sort of people. They are not all these incredible giants. Indeed, it says, Samuel said to the people, It is the Lord who made Moses and Aaron, and then goes on to say, and the Lord sent Yerubbaal and Bedan and Yiftach and Samuel. Now, who is this Yerubbaal? That is Gideon. It's a nickname for him. Who is Bedan? That is Samson, another nickname. And of course, Yiftach is actually Yiftach, and Samuel is the guy talking. Now, why does it do it this way? It says Moses and Aaron among his priests and Samuel among those who call his name. In Psalm 99, which we do every Friday night, by the way, the verse weighed 3 light ones of the world as equal to 3 significant ones of the world. That is to say, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel are like Yerubbaal and Bedan and Yiftach. Why is it done that way? Why do we have the 3 greats and the 3 not so greats? And trust me, Samuel might have been pretty nice, but both Gideon and Samson had some pretty major mistakes. Not even to mention Yiftach. Why have these 3 versus 3? To tell you that Yerubbaal in his generation is like Moses in his generation, like Bedan is in his generation, like Aaron in his, that Yiftach is like Samuel, meaning that even if you have what is obvious to you, a flawed person, you need a leader. You need somebody that will actually be providing the insights and interpretation. They may not be as gifted as Moses. No one ever is, but they are still who you've got. And that means you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and the judge who shall be with you in those days. As we saw back in, as we also can see in Deuteronomy 17, you can only go to the judge in one's days, right? Who else do I get to go to? Am I going to hold a seance? And it says, do not say, how was it that the former days were better than these? The lament of Ecclesiastes, of nostalgia, that all of the leaders of the past were greater than the leaders of the present. We already know from the beginning, we have to go to the person we're with. We have to deal with those we are with. You cannot simply say, nobody today is as good as the rabbis 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So we will no longer interpret the law. We will no longer ask questions. We will no longer engage in this process. If we were to say that, Judaism would die. Instead, we have to say, we go to who we've got and we ask the questions and they answer as best as they can, just as all of the people of the past have had to do. And this has worked well enough with both great and less great people throughout our history, providing the structure for Judaism to continue to answer new questions and to provide better interpretation and deeper understanding of even questions that might have felt settled in the past. All right, so let's sum this up. Who is actually then answering the questions that we are dealing with tonight and for our next 2 weeks? Well, generally speaking, it means your current local rabbi answers religious questions. We're actually going to be looking at some of the questions that got kicked upstairs, but we're going to come back to that point in a little while. But in general, we start with the local authority who best knows the situation, eyes on the actual local environment. That means that that is a ruling for that community or questioner. If someone comes to me and says, Rabbi, is this chicken kosher? And I provide an answer to them, for them, that chicken is either kosher or not kosher, depending upon the answer that's been given. And if someone asks me, Rabbi, can we, for example, play musical instruments on Shabbat? The answer I give will be good for my community, but that doesn't bind any other synagogue or any other city to follow my answer, nor has it ever until we go all the way back to when there was the great Sanhedrin that could answer questions for the entire Jewish world. But we haven't had that for about 2,000 years. Like I said, other rabbis are allowed, and indeed it would be surprising if they didn't disagree. And that's why whenever someone writes an answer, they will use supporting arguments and sources in order to persuade other people. You will find throughout the history of Sheilot and Tshuvot that the rabbis go to great lengths over the ages to provide the explanation and justification for the opinions that they reach. They don't just say, I said no, deal with it. They say, I say no because bop, 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 bop. And in fact, usually they begin with the bop, 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 bop before they get to the answer at the end. We're not really big fans of people skipping to the final answer, the bottom line. because it's how you get there that makes the most impact on yourself practically and spiritually. Again, the process is everything. A community can actually disagree with their rabbi. And indeed, there are many examples throughout our history of a rabbi wanting to implement a particular answer to a question, and the community goes, no, actually, we're not going to accept that answer. And that means the community can get a new rabbi. Unlike many other religious traditions, rabbis are kept around at the will of the community. If the community is not willing to call the rabbi their rabbi, not willing to both ask and accept the answers from that person, then that person's not really their rabbi, and they would get someone else. And likewise, if a rabbi found that the community was ignoring his or her teachings and not willing to abide by their rulings, that rabbi would most likely try to find a different community to become the rabbi for. Right? Being a rabbi is not something you just hang on the wall and then just, sit back and enjoy having that piece of paper. Being a rabbi means having a particular role within a community, and that is a mutually agreed upon relationship. It is not something that can be imposed, and it's not something that can be just assumed. It has to be something that will be repeated and strengthened and tested over and over throughout the lifespan of that relationship. All right, we're about to dive in to our main question for tonight. I've got to make a warning to you. This is the same warning I give to other people. Rabbi, I have a quick question. I hear this a lot, and I always try to remind people just because your question is quick doesn't mean the answer is quick. Like I hope you have understood from what I've said for the last half hour, the process is absolutely essential for understanding and reaching Jewish conclusions. And that means that you're going to probably get more information than just a yes or no. This is why the old joke is that the most common answer to a question is maybe, because there has to be more information, or depends, or yes and no, because Judaism does not boil down to simple pamphlet level understanding. It always requires more expansion. So I warn you now, this will not be a quick answer. So let's talk about women. And in fact, when we're talking about women in Judaism, there are a lot of things that we need to consider. The first is that in the ancient world, things were very different than they are today. And that meant that the aspects of Judaism were applied differently to the different people of that setting. Specifically, we have to realize that in the ancient world, there was a presumption, which was about 99% accurate, that all non-Jews were idolaters. We also realized that people reached legal maturity at the start of puberty. Again, neither of these would be considered true in the modern world. Also, 99% of real property was owned through tribal inheritance, and tribal inheritance was a uniquely male form. And that meant that women were beholden to their male relatives for their livelihoods. These different circumstances all influenced different rulings of Jewish law in the ancient world. And as you can probably imagine, that means that although the status of women was settled law for many, many centuries, because the status of the society was settled as well, that as the status of society has shifted in the last few hundred years, so too have the questions surrounding a woman's place in Jewish law begun to become open questions once again. Right? So that means that when we look back into the past, we're going to have to understand how the sages viewed a woman in antiquity as being very important for how they would obligate her to do different mitzvot, to fulfill the Torah, right? If she was beholden to her male relatives, it meant that while she was certainly not a slave, she was not also as free as those male relatives to decide her own time, to decide her own life, to decide other aspects of what she would do. That meant that they reasoned everybody, men and women, would be equally obligated would be equally prohibited for anything that the Torah prohibited. Men and women don't murder. Men and women don't break Shabbat. Men and women have to not cheat or steal or commit adultery or any of those other prohibitions. That was something that would be universally applicable to everyone. Everyone had to obey the don't do it commandments. However, obligations which were linked to a particular time, the ancient rabbis said should be considered optional for women. Now, the reason they said that these should be optional is because a woman was beholden to those male relatives under the structure of the economic system of the past, and that meant that her time was not always hers to decide what to do with. And the formal phrase that gets used for this is that women were not obligated for the positive time-bound commandments. If it was a thou shalt, and it had a particular time window in which it needed to be done, since we couldn't expect that women would always have the freedom from their families, meaning their family obligations that were being imposed upon them, to be able to do those commandments at that time, then they would not be obligated to do them. As a quick aside, unfortunately, throughout history, many people have taken not obligated to mean prohibited, but that was never the case in antiquity and also throughout most of our history. This is simply saying there was not a requirement for women to do certain commandments. For example, prayer, the wearing of tefillin, the waving of a lulav, and other such commandments. However, this is not a perfect rubric. This is not a 100% ironclad rule. The Kiddush or the eating of matzah at Passover are both very specific time-bound positive commandments. You will have matzah on Passover night. You cannot have a more positive commandment and a more time-bound commandment, but women are obligated 100% the same as men in that particular commandment, which means that there was a lot of inconsistency about where the women were obligated and were not for these positive commandments that also had a time element to them. So it's a general rule of thumb in the ancient world that they were not obligated to everything, but it's not a rule that is ironclad. All right, questions or comments, or am I going too fast? Oops, didn't mean to erase that. Okay. So nowadays, let's take a look. Are things still the same? Of course not. The last 200 years and really the last 50 years have seen dramatic changes in the condition of women, among many other people as well. Women now have, at least on paper, equal legal and financial rights. Women work, women own their own businesses, women own their own property. Women are not legally or, for the most part, socially beholden to men, and certainly not at all to the same degree that they were in the ancient world. That is quite revolutionary. And that means that, unsurprisingly, women have embraced the rights and freedoms from the general society, and they would also like to have those same rights and freedoms within Judaism as well. And so the question is, can they? It was not normal practice for women to do many things in the ancient world or up until the modern world because of the limitations that I just discussed. For example, women were not allowed to be a service leader. They could not stand up on the bima to lead the congregation in prayer. Now, the main reason for that was because there was a general rule in Judaism that somebody who is not obligated to perform a mitzvah is not allowed to perform that mitzvah on behalf of someone else. Meaning, if I am not obligated to do the Amidah, for example, then I cannot do the Amidah on your behalf, leading it just purely voluntarily. It's only because of my obligation that I am suitable for helping you to fulfill your obligation. And this has been a very important element of Judaism to prevent surrogacy fulfillment of the commandments. That we have to actually be equally bound by the commandment has been a very important concept. But since women were not equally bound through prayer, as our case for tonight, that would then mean that they were not eligible to lead the service. So in the modern world, where does that leave us? Can a woman lead the service? Now, I'm sure many of you were saying, hold on a second, Rabbi. Why are you asking this question in 2021? You've been here in Orlando for 11 years, and many of us have seen women leading services for a lot longer than that. Isn't this a settled question? The short answer is, for the conservative movement, by and large, yes. I will point out that there are some conservative synagogues where women do not lead the services. They are a small minority, but there are a few places in the world where the conservative movement congregations do not have that female leadership allowed, and they still follow the older tradition, and they are still part of the movement. But we have to understand the process. I think you've got that point by now. And you should also understand that even if some synagogues were allowing women to lead services long before there was a general consensus like we have now, that reaching a general consensus has been a very important part of not only our movement, but also of Jewish law. The many pages of work that have gone into explaining why different people feel that in this modern age, women can lead services, have been instrumental of studying the pattern of analysis and been instrumental in allowing us to see the ongoing, not flexibility, it's the ongoing adaptability of Jewish law to contemporary circumstances, whether those be the contemporary circumstances of 500 years ago or 500 years in the future. And well, this is still not a settled issue for all Jewish people. And that means that among the Orthodox, where women are still mostly not allowed to lead services where there are mixed congregations, meaning with men and women, that they still look to many of the arguments and positions that we have advanced and discussed over the last 50 years to gain insights and guidance for themselves and their communities. So this is settled as far as Temple Israel goes. We're not re-examining whether we're going to or not let women lead services. They are, and we can talk about some of those explanations as we go through. But this is still a very relevant topic for others and for ourselves. Understanding why it is allowed, I still believe, has great spiritual, psychological, and communal meaning. It is not simply enough at any point in Judaism to do something just because that's what we do. Forget that opening line in Fiddler on the Roof. We don't do things just because it's tradition. Instead, we should do them because we understand and we see why. That doesn't mean if you don't understand that you get to rebel, but it does mean that you should continue to seek understanding, even if you haven't quite seen the light just yet. All right. But what kind of questions could we be talking about in addition to women as service leaders? Well, there are 613 mitzvot, there are thousands of rulings, and there isn't one size fits all to answer the question of a woman's role in Judaism in the modern world. It doesn't work like that, right? They didn't answer, the ancient sages didn't answer all of the questions about women in Judaism with one or two words, and we will not either. Instead, we're going to have to look at a whole bunch of questions, and we will not do all of them, certainly not tonight, and certainly not even just in 3 weeks. Some of the questions might be, like I mentioned, women in prayer, women as Torah readers, women as leaders in general, meaning having community status, for example, being the president of a synagogue, women as rabbis officially, women serving as official witnesses, women and the issues surrounding divorce, women and issues surrounding modesty or tzniut, women and issues of family purity, taharat mishpacha, women as kohanim, if they serve as a kohen for blessings, women for wearing a talit, women wearing tefillin, wearing kippot or other head coverings, women being called up to the Torah for the blessing, and women being called to the Torah as a kohen or Levite. These are just some of the many questions, each of which deserves its own investigation and its own analysis. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, we've got about 14 minutes left tonight. And yes, we are not going to get everything I've got prepared out today. We will start, whatever I don't get tonight, we will start with next week. But how can I look at least what the conservative movement has said about these things? Well, that is where I'm going to direct you to the Rabbinical Assembly of our movement, rabbinicalassembly.org, Rabbinical Assembly, just like it sounds, .org, and I'm sure Google autocomplete will help you. And if you go to the section on Jewish law, you will find the many hundreds of different position papers that have been written, not just on women, but on a huge variety of life's questions from our movement. These tshuvot, these responses, only go back until around the 1980s. The ones before that are still being digitized and uploaded. But it is a great wealth of information and one that I highly recommend. And most of the excerpts that we'll be looking at today come from that body of literature. So please do yourself a favor and check it out, rabbinicalassembly.org. And you're looking for the issues on Jewish law. And it'll be under the questions of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which is the umbrella committee that meets for the conservative movement to answer some of the most difficult questions. It doesn't override any of the decisions by local congregations. That's why local congregations could be letting women read from the Torah or lead services long before that committee passed tshuvot responses on that point. But it does provide the perhaps best example of the deep reasoning and explanation for these different issues. So let's get into it. We'll begin with a little bit into the past. This was written by Rabbi Philip Siegel, and this was one of his many points that he made. Most of these tshuvot are anywhere from 10 to 100 pages. They are not short. But I've taken, I hope, representative excerpts from some of the different explanations of why women could serve in these capacities. Similarly, the Amoraim, that is to say, the rabbis of the age of the Talmud, argued that women were not obligated to perform every mitzvah which was not determined by time. Thus, they argued, men and not women were enjoined to study Torah, to reproduce, and to redeem the firstborn. So what he's saying is that there were also positive commandments that were not time-bound, that nevertheless, the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmud, said women also were not obligated to. Again, proving that was not a 100% rule of only positive time-bound commitments had no obligation. And by the way, when you see numbers in this, I left them here very deliberately, those are footnotes. Footnotes are a blessing, as wonderfully in-depth as many of the arguments are. The footnotes help expand on the arguments and provide the necessary citations so that we can go and double check what somebody is saying and see what else they might have meant. So very, very essential. Certain anomalies arose. Women were exempt from reciting the Shema as a mitzvah determined by time, but obligated to recite the tefillah, meaning the Amidah, which was also determined by time. They were exempt from donning tefillin, which was determined by time, but obligated to recite the grace after meal, Birkat HaMazon. And although grace, meaning Birkat HaMazon, is clearly related to time, by rabbinic fiat, it was declared not to be. Of course, it is time-bound. It's right after you eat. How much more time-bound could you be? But the rabbis decided that it would not be considered that category and that women would be obligated to perform the mitzvah of Birkat HaMazon. In this and many other particulars, the principle of mitzvah determined by time and its reverse became a patchwork of contradictory halachot and cannot serve as a rational basis for contemporary practice. So he's laying part of the groundwork here of saying, you can't just say women can't lead because women aren't obligated to prayer, because the rabbis had a rule that if it was a time-bound positive commandment, there was no obligation. And if you're not obligated, you can't do it. Because that rule of time-bound positive commandments not having obligation upon women is simply not a consistent rule. And that means that we need to establish an understanding of obligation that is deeper. Right, so he goes on to say, it is clear from our sources that at one time, women read from the Torah before the public. And if you have ever seen my Pathways to Judaism class on women, you'll see the citations for that. This is the only meaning that can be attached to the Tanaic, the earlier Mishnah source, that informs us that women are eligible as participants in the quorum of 7 that are called to the Torah on Shabbat. Only later were women declared ineligible to read from the Torah out of respect for the congregation, kavod hasibur. And yet, there were some medieval scholars who conceded that there is no real impediment to their reading before the public. So here we get a glimpse of the process of looking through the original sources, recognizing that there are opinions that are older, that would allow a woman to read from the Torah, recognizing that there was a question and an answer within a later time that said, now we're not going to allow it because in our current circumstances, it would be considered disrespectful to the congregation, meaning that it went from allowed to disallowed, that it's not a question of it's always been disallowed, but it was allowed, then was disallowed. But even while disallowed, the medieval scholars would point out that it was technically allowed, but the practice of not allowing it would continue out of respect for their continuing circumstances, meaning that they continually felt that it would be more respectful for the congregation to not allow the women to read. You can begin to see how if those circumstances change, that allowing women to do what they had been allowed to do at the beginning, and which always technically was possible, allowing that to begin again would make perfect sense. Likewise, as he goes on, in this way too, it should be understood that if a woman is eligible to recite the brachot, she is also competent to enable those who are unable to do so for themselves to discharge their obligation. Meaning that if it's true that she can, then that means that she should be able to fulfill this role. In addition, there is no explicit prohibition placed upon a woman to keep her from enabling the public to fulfill its obligation, even in the context where this could have been done. When, for example, a deaf mute, an imbecile, and a minor were so barred, meaning the rabbis had no problem listing those that were absolutely forbidden from doing certain things. And in this particular case, women were not listed among those that were prohibited. Okay, quick question I got through chat. Respectful for the congregation as no. So the question is, whose respect for the congregation were they concerned with? Was that because they were trying to respect the women or trying to be respectful of the men? The general feel of that particular passage seems to be that many men were embarrassed that they could not read from the Torah, but a woman could, and that created a lot of resentment and bitterness. And in order to avoid the resentment and bitterness and to encourage more men to be comfortable in the setting, they disallowed women from reading to avoid hurting feelings, if you will. Now, that may sound like a very, very petty and meaningless way of prohibiting someone from reading from Torah, but Judaism is very sensitive to people's feelings. And we do try to protect people's feelings wherever possible. Obviously, in my own opinion, I think in the modern world especially, that there shouldn't be feelings of hurt if a man is not able to read, and he should instead be glad that there are people in our community, men, women, or other, that can. But I can understand at least the initial reaction in the ancient world and classical and medieval world. And it's something that we can then realize that it's resting upon feelings. And as feelings change, well, the ruling should change as well. Oh, and click back on the main screen. We can then fast forward to a more contemporary. And to give you a little bit of a contrast between the conservative opinion that we just had, this is a modern Orthodox woman Rabbah, which is a term that is roughly parallel to rabbi, trying to provide a summary of different positions within the Orthodox world on this topic. And I'll let her explain. One of the leading opponents of women's ordination is Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who is the senior Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University in New York. And if you don't know Yeshiva University, well, you should. Yeshiva University is one of the flagship institutions of the Orthodox world in the United States. His psak, his ruling, is unequivocal. a woman cannot receive ordination. The reason he uses, remember, we demand reasons in Judaism. You're not just allowed to say no. To support this ruling is interesting. He argues that a rabbi's role is, by definition, an outward-facing one, and that as such, it contravenes the foundational Jewish value of modesty, of tzniut. Aware that his argument logically points to the elimination of male rabbis as well, tzniut is a value, modesty is a value that applies to both men and women, he is quick to point out that Jewish life cannot function without such roles. And so, to the extent that it is necessary to have rabbis, the role should at least be restricted to men. Or to put it into his own words, we too must therefore strive to be anonymous and maintain strict privacy. That this is what the general call is to an average Jewish person. We know that Hashem did reveal himself on rare occasions. God did actually project into the world, and this is known as Gilui Shekhinah. So, on occasions, we are called upon to do things in a demonstrative fashion and in a public forum. We need a shaliach tzibur, a prayer leader, to lead us in tefillah. We need a rabbi. We do recognize that there are times we need a public-facing person. But even then, we recommend that whenever possible, only the men should compromise on tzniut and modesty and take these public positions, meaning the men will have to self-sacrifice by allowing themselves to be made public when they'd much rather not be. And they'll be the ones to lay down across the barbed wire of the public sphere so that no one else has to. No one else meaning women. Women are always encouraged to avoid compromising their privacy. So his point that he's making in this excerpt is that women should not be allowed to be shlichei tzibur or to be rabbis because that is too public a role for them. No one should really be doing it, but since someone has to do it, better a man should do it than a woman have to suffer by going through that public position. Now, the Orthodox world is not uniform. And in fact, Rabbi Dina Brauer brings another position as well, this time from the chief rabbi of Israel back in the early part of her creation, Ben Zion Uziel. And he was the Sephardic rabbi, the chief rabbi of the time. And while he doesn't talk about the question of female ordination directly, he does address the issue of women's modesty and argues in favor of greater female lay leadership roles in the synagogue. In his words, it is common sense that in a serious meeting and meaningful conversation, there is no question of a lack of modesty. Basically saying, if you're at a board meeting, no one is going to think that this is going to become an orgy. No one thinks that this is going to be a licentious or immodest activity. This is just business. And sitting in the proximity of women when involved in communal affairs, which is work of holiness, meaning doing community affairs, does not lead to lightheartedness, immodesty, right? No one starts getting frivolous and flirty just because they're sitting next to a woman when they're at a budget and finance meeting. They are doing the sacred work of the community, often very hard and sometimes even a little dull, but very necessary. And no one is going to think that this is just a social gathering where people might get a little bit more off track. For all Israel are holy people, and her women are holy, and are not to be suspect for a breach of modesty and morality. So his position is quite the opposite. Now, is he arguing for ordination? No, he did not. But is he undercutting one of the counter arguments to ordination? Absolutely, he is. And that issue of a person having a public position is one that, in our analysis, was not such a major issue. Within the Orthodox world, the question of tzniut, of modesty, is handled very differently. Modesty being a relative term in every community and throughout every age. Instead, we can do, and we'll just finish up with this one, and that'll get us most of the way there. Rabbi Meir Rabinowitz gives us a good summary of what we're looking for. Right, the basic criteria of qualifying to be included in a minyan are: 1, belonging to a class of adults, you're not a kid, and 2, free individuals. You need to actually be free. Unfortunately, in the ancient world, if you were a slave, a Jewish slave could not be counted in a minyan because, again, they were beholden to someone else. In the rabbinic period, women were at certain age classified as adults. It's what we call being over bat mitzvah age. You are a bat mitzvah. But they were never classified as being completely free because they started life as being legally subservient either to father, brother, or were married to their husbands. No one in our society can reasonably argue that a woman is not legally free as a man, nor would anyone today challenge her status as an adult. The criteria for eligibility to be counted in a minyan have therefore not changed. What has changed is the reality which now enlarges the number of those who meet the criteria. So, beautiful summary about including women in a minyan, but why is it necessary? Right. First of all, we already saw from Rabbi Siegel that there was an alternative explanation. This explanation comes along and provides a different explanation, partly assuming that Rabbi Siegel's was incomplete or ineffective. But there was another position to consider, which would be, why not just say that we're changing the definition of minyan, or that we don't need a minyan anymore? Why not just throw the whole concept out the door and be free to do whatever we want? Well, indeed, that is partly the response of the Reform movement, and to a lesser degree, the Reconstructionist movement. But in the conservative movement, and certainly within the Orthodox, and most importantly, for most of the last 2,000 years in most parts of the world, we did not feel that we should simply jettison the centuries of precedent and the many volumes of analysis and understanding. That we do feel that we are wisest and best guided when we are standing on the shoulders of the giants. We absolutely do still need to analyze their words within the situation of today, but we do not feel that we are completely allowed to start from scratch, to begin over the process of creating Jewish tradition and understanding from the Torah itself. We believe in the chain of analysis, of understanding, and of transmission of wisdom and insight that allows us to reach this point. And we have found it to be completely compatible with the needs of all of our contemporary periods, whether those be in the Roman times, the Byzantine times, the times of the Crusades, the times of the Renaissance, the times of the Enlightenment, or the times of today. We are always able to find insight and meaning best because we are drawing from this very, very deep well. And so we might be seen by an outsider to be unnecessarily hamstringing ourselves, shackling ourselves to the past, but it is the past that gives us our strength and structure. It is the past that allows us to find wisdom that we would be unable to find on our own. But the past is not a prison. The past is not a permanent museum piece. The past is a vector that is moving forward with energy and direction, and which we take over, and we have to continue its direction. We didn't get through quite as much of the text on the acceptance of women as part of the minyan and service leaders, and so we'll look into that in more detail next week. And if you give me just 1 second, I'm going to put into the chat a list of links that you may be interested in browsing. Come on. Sorry, my computer seems to be objecting a little bit here. Come on. There we are. And let's put this into our chat. If anybody's watching through YouTube and does not have their chat capability, actually, hold on. I can actually put this in chat on YouTube. I forgot I had that open. Did that work? Go ahead. Maybe. Oh, it's way too long for YouTube chat. Hold on a second. I've never tried to paste anything quite that large. Let me put in a few pieces at a time. If anyone has any questions that you would like to ask, feel free to unmute and ask them now before we wrap up for tonight, while I'm taking care of the YouTube chat information. These are all passages and files taken from the Rabbinical Assembly website. So as I mentioned, this is the place to go for a great dose of information and inspiration on lots of topics, not only what we're talking about today. And I think I just have one more to put in YouTube, and then I can give my undivided attention to one screen at a time. Okay. Any questions or comments before we wrap up for tonight then? All right. So hopefully you got the basic idea that you need to keep asking questions, and that the process is the point. And although we get different answers, that if we are engaging in the process, then we are carrying on the sacred path of our people that was set down and sanctioned and required by the Torah from the beginning. That means every time you think you have a question, you are in fact required to ask your rabbi. I love when people ask questions because it means there's more of Judaism I get to share with them. And if it's a question I don't know, then that means I get to learn something new too. And that's always a very special thing. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. I hope you'll be able to join us next week as well, as we continue this conversation and look at other topics affecting women in Jewish law and how we handle it in the modern world. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.